You won't be needed anymore. Elena Vargas Security will escort you out. The words sliced through the rarefied quiet of the Imperial chamber at the Grand Lisboa Tower, Macau. 12 CEOs sat in a perfect oval, their Mont Blanc pens poised over memorandums of understanding worth $1.9 billion USD. Afternoon sunlight spilled through floor-to-ceiling glass, catching the edges of crystal goblets filled with imported still water. The air held that particular tension only found when years of groundwork are seconds from paying off. I had arranged every detail, nameplates calibrated to manage rivalries, menus honoring cultural traditions, and multilingual interpreters stationed discreetly out of sight. This was my room, my stage. And yet, standing in the doorway, Victor Lang wore the smug grin of a man convinced he owned it. He didn't lower his voice. He wanted every executive in that circle to hear. From my left, I caught the smallest movement, Mr. Sato, CEO of a Tokyo-based conglomerate, giving me a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't pity, it was understanding. I'd given 21 years to this corporation. 2 decades of red-eye flights, 5-star hotel rooms where the minibar was dinner, and calendar weeks where weekend was just another workday in another country. I'd skipped my sister's wedding for a Berlin arbitration that no one else could have navigated. I spoke enough Mandarin to close a deal without a translator and enough German to stop a $50 million error mid-negotiation. My job was never ceremonial. It was the invisible architecture holding billion-dollar bridges together. Victor was the opposite. Where I built foundations, he polished veneers. Where I planned contingencies, he planned press photos. In the 14 months he'd sat in his chair, he'd coasted on deals I'd locked in years before he knew what cross-border compliance meant. Once in a corridor, thinking I couldn't hear, he told a board member, "We need someone younger, hungrier." And now, in front of a dozen of the most powerful decision-makers on the planet, he was spending that line for spectacle. I didn't leap up. My eyes went to my seat, my place now holding Victor's black leather folio open to bullet points he'd probably rehearsed in front of a mirror. The heat in my face wasn't humiliation. It was the cold clarity that every ounce of precision I'd poured into this summit had been turned into a prop for my public removal. Slowly, deliberately, I rose. The scrape of my chair seemed louder than his voice. Every gaze followed me. The warm, charged air had shifted. It wasn't a conference room anymore. It was a Winterfield silent and waiting for the next move. I didn't leave the Imperial chamber right away. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was the weight of 21 years pressing down on my shoulders, daring me to remember exactly what they'd cost. Back then, 2 decades ago, I was a junior trade coordinator at our Singapore headquarters, holding a passport full of blank pages and a head full of half-mastered languages. My nights were for flashcards, my mornings for conference calls across time zones I couldn't track without a map pinned above my desk. By my 3rd year, I could move from English to Mandarin to Portuguese in the span of a single conversation, catching nuances that saved contracts from collapsing under cultural misunderstandings. Deals were my lifeblood. Not the glossy ones with ribbon cuttings and camera crews, but the quiet, grueling victories like the 27-hour arbitration in Seoul that ended with a handshake seconds before the deadline. Or the Geneva summit that pulled me from my parents' 40th wedding anniversary because the Swiss delegation refused to finalize without me reviewing the last draft. My marriage didn't survive the years of airports, boardrooms, and missed dinners. The company did. That was the difference between me and Victor Lang. I built trust quietly, brick by brick, in 6 continents and over a dozen currencies. Victor built an image-tailored suit's press-ready quotes for the shareholder bulletin. The kind of presence that looked good on a cover page, but cracked under pressure. Where I saw deals as bridges, he saw them as podiums. I remembered one moment in particular last year in Dubai, sitting across from Henrik Meissner, CEO of a Berlin tech consortium. During a coffee break, he leaned in and said, "I wouldn't commit a cent of this if your name weren't on it, Elena." It wasn't flattery, it was truth. The contracts only held because both sides trusted me to guard them. Yet months later, it was Victor who stood on a stage in Shanghai accepting the firm's Global Excellence Award for that very project, a project that had been minutes from imploding until I caught a mistranslation in a penalty clause at the 11th hour. He never mentioned me. He didn't need to. The applause washed over him while I sat in the back, hands folded, swallowing the knowledge that I'd just saved his career from its first real failure. Now standing in the Imperial chamber, the memory burned hotter than humiliation. I wasn't here because I'd failed. I was here because my success was inconvenient. Victor's ambush didn't happen in a vacuum, it had been brewing for months. Small, deliberate cuts disguised as strategic realignments. The first time he tested the phrase, younger energy, was over cappuccinos in the executive lounge. The second, it was a fresh face for the brand slipped into a budget meeting as if 21 years of my results had somehow expired. By the third time, it had morphed into refreshing our leadership image, a thinly veiled dismissal no one in the boardroom dared to challenge. I'd been in this industry long enough to recognize the scent of a coup when it was in the air. What I hadn't anticipated, what still burned in my chest, was that Victor Lang wouldn't wait for a clean, quiet transition. He wanted spectacle. And he had chosen his stage. If you've been following Elena's journey and want to see exactly how she turns this victory into her next power move, make sure you subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. Today wasn't just another meeting, it was the day 12 CEOs from across 5 continents had gathered in the Imperial chamber at the Grand Lisboa Tower to finalize a $1.9 billion strategic partnership. He knew the hallway was thick with media crews, that aides were stationed at every door, that the stakes were higher than they'd ever been. He didn't want me eased out via a polite Monday morning memo. He wanted my erasure to be the centerpiece of his debut in front of the most powerful audience he could assemble barely 20 minutes before the signing. My phone buzzed. A message from Leona, one of the very few assistants I trusted. He's brought her. She's in the hall, waiting. I didn't need to ask who her was, the so-called strategic hire Victor had been grooming to take my seat. I stared at the words, letting them blur for a moment. The anger came fast, sharp, instinctive, but decades in negotiation rooms had taught me the value of stillness. Rage is useful only when banked, honed, and deployed at the precise moment. Outwardly, I adjusted my navy jacket, reviewed the seating chart, and continued placing the final briefing packets, as though nothing inside me had shifted. Then another notification lit my screen. This one wasn't meant for me. It was a forwarded internal email Victor had accidentally copied me on weeks ago. The subject line made my stomach knot: photo capture, leadership refresh, Imperial event. The body detailed exactly where the photographer should stand to get the widest shot of the incoming lead replacing the outgoing me. I'd seen cynical corporate plays before, but this was textbook humiliation choreography, engineered to be photographed, packaged, and circulated as proof of his visionary leadership. The helplessness was almost physical. There was nothing I could do to stop him from walking into this room and performing his power grab. But under the weight of that fury, I held onto a colder truth. He was walking straight into a trap he didn't even know existed. And all I had to do was let him. I'd known for months that Victor would try something. What I didn't know was when or how brazen he'd be. That's why the continuity clause existed. It had been a seed planted 6 months earlier during the earliest talks for this deal. I'd seen too many negotiations collapse after sudden leadership changes. A handshake meant nothing if the person who made it was gone before the ink dried. So I drafted language that protected both parties. The clause was simple, neutral. If the principal liaison named in the agreement is replaced or removed at any point before the final signing, all memorandums of understanding are automatically void. It never mentioned me by name, but in every draft I was the liaison. Of course, it couldn't be presented as self-preservation that would have raised alarms. Instead, I framed it as a matter of efficiency and respect for each CEO's time and resources. I used every language I had: the soft, persuasive rhythm of Japanese for Mr. Sato, the clipped precision of German for Henrik Meissner, and the measured tones of Mandarin for Liu Chen. This isn't about individuals, I told them. It's about continuity. You invest months of work, you deserve to know the person you trust will be there until the ink dries. One by one, they agreed. Some viewed it as a safeguard against corporate infighting. Others liked the subtle leverage it gave them. And Victor Lang, he signed off on the drafts without a second glance, more interested in the branding mock-ups than the legal text. The clause was buried in paragraph 14 under mutual obligations, a section he never read past the headline. I remember a call with Mr. Sato just after we'd locked in the final language. His voice was low, steady in my earpiece. If he tries to push you out, we will leave the table. All of us. There was no bravado in his tone, just a statement of fact. That kind of loyalty isn't bought. It's earned year after year, deal after deal. So as I stood in the Imperial chamber listening to Victor orchestrate my public removal, my pulse didn't spike. I didn't argue. I didn't even look at him. Because while he believed this was his crowning moment, I knew something he didn't. Removing me was the detonator. The clause wasn't symbolic. It was binding law, agreed to and signed by every leader in that room. With a single sentence, Victor had just voided $1.9 billion in agreements. All I had to do was watch. But that continuity clause was only the first lock. The second was far smaller, far more personal, small enough to fit in the palm of my hand. Every MOU on that table looked final pages, thick with clauses and adorned with signatures from each CEO. But those were merely ceremonial drafts. The enforceable versions required one last element: my encrypted digital signature. Without it, those documents were nothing more than expensive stationery. That signature wasn't stored on any company server. It lived on a hardware security token no bigger than a house key locked in the inner pocket of my leather tote. I carried it everywhere: Macau, Zurich, São Paulo, and today was no different. Macau, Zurich, Tokyo, São Paulo, even today. The system had been my idea after a near disaster 4 years ago, when a rival firm tried to slip in a falsified approval while I was on a flight from Lisbon to Singapore. After that, I worked with our legal team to create a secure signing process that couldn't be tampered with. Once my hardware token was connected and my passcode entered, the signature would authenticate and timestamp the final contract. If anyone tried to access those files without authorization, the system would instantly send a full report of the attempted breach, IP address, location, and timestamp to my personal attorney. I could feel the familiar weight of that token inside my leather tote as Victor Lang paraded around the Imperial chamber. Oblivious. He thought today's spectacle was permanent. That stripping me of my title also stripped me of every thread of influence. But influence doesn't vanish just because you leave the table, it follows the chain of trust. And I still held the final link. In my mind, I replayed the moment this safeguard was born 1 year ago in my attorney's office in Singapore. She leaned forward, her tone measured but unyielding. The day he decides to take you down, this will be your insurance. They can fire you, Elena, but they can't fire your signature. Now, as I watched Victor shuffle the MOU packets like a casino dealer at a rigged table, I almost smiled. He could seat his hand-picked successor in my chair, pose for the photographers, and flood internal channels with announcements about fresh leadership. But without my key, without my code, the deal could not close. The CEOs knew it. Their legal teams knew it. And soon, Victor would know it too. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to halt the meeting. My control wasn't loud, it was precise, deliberate, and absolute. Because in a room full of paper, I was the ink. The moment I rose from my seat, the temperature in the Imperial chamber seemed to drop. I didn't speak. I didn't object. I simply slid my chair back into place with the same meticulous care I'd used to arrange it hours earlier. The silence that followed had weighed an unspoken signal only those seasoned in boardrooms could read. Pens once poised lowered slowly. Pages that had been spread open were closed, stacked neatly. I caught the flicker of eyes meeting across the table. Victor didn't notice, or worse, mistook it for compliance. He stepped into my seat as if it had always been his, flipping through the top MOU with rehearsed confidence. "Let's proceed," he said. His voice carried manufactured authority. But momentum is fragile. It lives in trust. And the trust in that room had shifted with me the moment I stepped away. It was the CEO from Oslo who broke the rhythm. He leaned back in his chair, his voice calm but direct. "Mr. Lang, could you clarify the scope and application of Clause 17? The question hung in the air. Clause 17 wasn't just a line item, it was the keystone that balanced risk allocation across 12 jurisdictions. I had written it, negotiated it, and defended it through 14 revisions. Victor Lang had never once been in the room for those debates. I watched him freeze just for a fraction of a second before his eyes darted to the page, scanning desperately for something that could give him a lifeline. "Well, Clause 17 addresses the scope." "Without her," interrupted Henrik Meissner from Munich, his German accent sharpening each word, "who ensures our terms are honored." It wasn't a question. It was an indictment. Around the table, small, deliberate movements began. The CEO from Singapore closed her leather folio with a quiet snap. Another from São Paulo capped his pen and set it neatly in the center of his pad. The Oslo CEO didn't break his gaze from Victor. From the periphery, a subtler shift, a pair of interpreters stationed discreetly behind their respective clients began gathering their headsets and notebooks. They walked toward the door without a word. Moments later, one of the legal aides followed. The soft thud of the door closing behind them sounded far louder than it should have. Victor's voice faltered. His sentences thinned into half-formed phrases. He began flipping pages too quickly, as though speed could disguise ignorance. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was dense, filled with calculation, with unspoken conclusions, with the dawning understanding that this meeting was no longer moving toward a signature, but toward an exit. I stayed where I was, a few steps back from the table, my leather tote over my shoulder, hands loosely clasped. I didn't need to speak to be heard. In rooms like this, silence is a language all its own. And at that moment, it was speaking volumes. The silence broke not with a cough or a shuffle, but with the slow scrape of a chair leg across polished marble. The Oslo CEO rose, smoothing the front of his tailored charcoal jacket. His expression was neutral, but his words carried the precision of a verdict. "As per the continuity clause," he said evenly, "our memorandum is now void. Without the named liaison, there is no agreement." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The words landed like a gavel at the center of the table. For a long moment, Victor didn't move. He seemed to think he could negotiate this the way he handled everything, by pretending the words hadn't been spoken. "We can still move forward," Victor Lang began, gesturing toward the folders. "We have consensus on the but." The CEO from Oslo was already closing his binder, sliding it into his briefcase without a second glance. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the door. That was the first crack in the dam. The CEO from São Paulo rose next, muttering something to his aide in Portuguese before following Oslo out. Across the table, the Singapore delegate leaned toward her interpreter, whispered once, then began neatly stacking her documents. Victor's voice rose, a brittle edge creeping in. "If we could all just please sit down, we can resolve any concerns." They didn't even acknowledge him. I stayed still, my hands loosely folded in front of me, my leather tote resting against my hip. This was no longer my fight to win. I had already won the moment he removed me. Now I was simply watching the inevitable play out. Henrik Meissner from Munich moved next. He walked the length of the table with steady purpose, stopping in front of me. His hand extended not to Victor, but to me. You were always the deal, he said quietly, his grip firm. Our eyes locked for a moment before he released my hand and turned toward the exit. It was more than a compliment. It was an affirmation of years of trust built across continents. And Victor heard it. I saw the way his jaw tightened, the flicker of something behind his eyes. Anger, maybe panic. Near the far end of the table, the CEO from Toronto rose. She left her pen in the center of her open folder, ink tip pointing away. In certain circles, that gesture was absolute. The deal was finished. Victor saw it too. He stepped toward her, his voice cracking slightly. We can fix this, just give me. But the door closed behind her before he could finish. One by one, the chairs emptied. The air shifted from tense to hollow. What remained were untouched glasses of water, translation headsets abandoned on the table, and the fading echo of leather soles on marble. I didn't smile, not outwardly, but deep inside, beneath the calm facade I'd worn all morning, there was a slow, steady pulse of satisfaction. The truth didn't need defending. It was already walking out the door. I was halfway down the marble hallway when the first raised voice reached me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Victor, sharp, brittle, the sound of someone who'd just lost control. I slowed my pace, pretending to scroll through my phone while the words spilled from the half-open doors of the Imperial chamber. Get legal on the line now, chairs scraped. Someone fumbled with the speakerphone. From just beyond the threshold, I heard the clipped, deliberate voice of our chief counsel. Mr. Lang, without the named liaison's participation at final signing, Clause 14 voids all MOUs, and without her encrypted signature, the system will not authenticate the contracts. A pause followed, long enough for me to picture the exact look on Victor's face. Then came his reply, low and strained. We'll override it. You can't, the lawyer said flatly. It's hard-coded. Even attempting to bypass it will trigger legal alerts. Silence. Then the faint click of a laptop opening, followed by a groan I recognized instantly. He was staring at the message I'd known he'd see: final signature missing. Contract invalid. I took a slow, measured breath. This was the part of the game I never had to play out loud. A sharper-than-usual email ping broke the air inside the room. I didn't need to see the contents to know it was bad. My gut already told me. Moments later, a junior staffer slipped out, phone pressed to her ear, whispering to another as they hurried past me. The fragments reached my ears. From Oslo. Sent to the board. Said they won't work with instability. It was almost too perfect. I lingered near the elevator bank, far enough to stay unseen, close enough to catch pieces of Victor's frantic instructions. Draft a statement, market stability, strong leadership. No one says void. No one says withdrawal. His voice climbed higher, as though volume alone could rewrite the reality closing in on him. But reality was already moving faster than he could chase it. The PR director exited next, her face pale, her notepad clutched like a shield. Another staffer followed, muttering something about checking in with their team. The hallway grew quieter with each set of departing footsteps. By the time I stepped into the elevator, I could still hear Victor pacing inside, his words, tangling into half-formed strategies that wouldn't survive the next hour. The doors slid shut, cutting off the noise entirely. For a moment, I let myself smile, a small private acknowledgement. I didn't need to see his panic to know exactly what it looked like. I'd spent decades in negotiation rooms. Collapse has a rhythm, and I could recognize it in an instant. And in that rhythm, I heard the truth. He hadn't just lost the deal, he'd handed it to me. Outside, the cool Macau air sliced through the fading adrenaline that had carried me out of the Imperial chamber. I walked slowly down the granite steps of the Grand Lisboa Tower, each one feeling a little lighter than the last. The deal was gone for Victor Lang, and for me. It wasn't ending. It was simply shifting form, already moving toward me from across the plaza. My phone buzzed in my hand. The caller ID lit up with a name I knew well, Sato, CEO of the Tokyo firm. I stepped aside, letting a flow of pedestrians pass, and answered. Elena-san, His voice was warm, steady, not the formal tone he used in conference calls. "I believe you've already heard the outcome inside. I have," I said. "Good," he replied with the faintest hint of satisfaction. "We would like you to serve as our direct advisor for the next phase of this project. Not as an employee of your company, but as an independent with full authority over negotiations and the budget to match." I felt the weight of those words. Independent, full authority. They weren't just terms, they were a declaration. "That's generous," I said carefully. "It's deserved," he replied. "Without you, there is no foundation for trust. We want the foundation." We spoke for several minutes, sketching the framework of my new role. The compensation was more than comfortable, higher than I'd ever earned under Victor's leadership, and the autonomy was absolute. When the call ended, my phone vibrated again almost immediately. This time, it was a text from Henrik Meissner in Munich. "If you're available, we'd like you to lead our portion of the venture. Same conditions as before, only if you're at the helm. 2 offers in less than 10 minutes." My steps slowed. This wasn't just salvaging my career. This was reclaiming the position I had always truly held, even when my title hadn't said so. Then a third notification appeared, this one from an unfamiliar number. "We are prepared to sign once Elena Vargas is confirmed as lead negotiator." The sender's name followed a major institutional investor I knew had been wavering for months. I stood still for a moment, the noise of the city blurring around me. In the space of a single morning, Victor had managed to lose the confidence of the global boardroom, and I had been handed the keys to it. This victory wasn't loud. There were no cameras, no staged headlines. At least not yet. But it was complete. And it was mine. I slipped the phone back into my leather tote and kept walking. Not toward the subway, but toward a quiet cafe tucked between 2 narrow streets in Macau's old quarter. It seemed like the right place to start drafting my own terms for my own future. After more than 21 years of building bridges for others to cross, I was finally the one deciding where they led. And this time, no one else would hold the map. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows felt warmer here, as if it knew it was shining on a chapter I had fought too long to reach. My new office wasn't extravagant, but every inch of it was mine. The desk was bare, except for my leather notebook open to fresh pages and my laptop, which displayed the draft contract for the international venture I was now leading. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for a knock that would drag me into a battle I hadn't started. Today, I was the one calling the meetings. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. When the door opened, it wasn't an assistant, it was Henrik Meissner, the CEO from Munich. He stepped in with the same measured confidence I had seen countless times in boardrooms, but his expression carried something new, personal respect. "Elena," he said, placing a folder on my desk, "this is the finalized MOU for the joint venture. We've all signed. Yours is the last signature." I opened it slowly, letting the moment settle. My name was printed cleanly at the top of the leadership page, not buried in footnotes or acknowledgments, but in bold beneath the title, Chief Negotiation Advisor. This time there was no one to override it, no hidden agenda waiting to erase it. I stood walking with him into the adjacent conference room. The chair at the head of the table was larger than the one in the Imperial chamber. When I sat down, I couldn't help but remember the sharp scrape of my old chair being taken from me that day. The difference now was undeniable. The table was longer, the view broader, and the faces around it, more CEOs than had ever gathered in that room, were here because they wanted me here. As the discussion began, my hand brushed something at the corner of the table, a sleek black Montblanc pen. Recognition was instant. It was the one Henrik had left behind in the Imperial chamber, as a quiet signal that the deal was over without me. "Thought you should have it," Henrik murmured, leaning closer so only I could hear. "It belongs to the person who kept the deal honest." I turned the pen in my hand, feeling not its weight in grams but in years of flights, negotiations, sacrifices, and quiet endurance. This time, when the pen met the paper, the room was still. No cameras. No staged applause. Just ink anchoring my role in a place no one could remove. It wasn't about proving Victor wrong anymore. It was about proving myself right. And as I looked around, I knew this wasn't just full circle. It was a larger circle, one I had drawn myself.